Does this make sense to you? Scenario Fitting by Sceptikat, Part 13, Preventing Herd Immunity, narrated by Andrew Mather. Contact tracing and testing. Action if acting in the interest of the population. Avoid as costly and pointless. A costly, complex exercise with little benefit and a lot of risk, especially combined with the sweeping powers of public health officers to remove people. UK government action. Pursue and even mandate. Actively pursuing and mandating contact tracing. Meanwhile, if contacts are successfully traced and then isolated, we are preventing and delaying group immunity. The stated goal of test and trace programs is to stop the spread of the virus. Test and trace in reality does nothing to achieve that. As COVID-related deaths and hospitalizations are extremely low, test and trace, if it works at all, and it probably doesn't, merely identifies people with no or mild symptoms. The more such people are identified, the closer we are to herd immunity. What test and trace actually identifies is not a dangerous spike, but herd immunity. Track and trace programs would have a different purpose in the case of diseases with high mortality that are still at a containable stage. You would want to treat and isolate the affected and contact, inform, warn and maybe isolate those who have been in contact with the infected. However, when you are tracking and tracing asymptomatic mild cases without a large number of hospitalizations or deaths occurring, you log the positives as progress towards herd immunity and you scale back the measures crippling lives and the economy accordingly. Our government does the opposite. Finding many asymptomatic cases is declared to be a terrible and frightening situation, and the life-destroying measures are intensified and increased. Misrepresenting the results of COVID test and trace programs is particularly galling when we consider how pointless test and trace is for airborne viruses that have been spreading for some time. If it is indeed true that standing close to a person for 15 minutes can infect someone, then just one infected Londoner in March, pre-lockdown, who travelled on the tube, got lunch in a sandwich shop, got coffee once or twice, went to Tesco, would easily have stood close to 50 people in a day. If those people did the same, after 10 days only, 100 quadrillion people would have been exposed and thus needed to be tracked and traced. Of course, it is different in rural areas, but the point remains that either standing close to someone for 15 minutes is not how COVID spreads, in which case track and trace is pointless, or that is how COVID spreads, but then the majority will have been exposed long before lockdowns and quarantines and masks, rendering track and trace equally pointless. Consider, for example, the flu. About 1 billion people are infected each year. Testing and tracing 1 billion people would be unmanageable, futile and utterly pointless. And if we consider the strong evidence from several countries that COVID has been around since 2019, even since early 2019, the chance that someone came into contact with an infected person at some point by late March this year, start of the lockdown, is close to 100%, except for those who lead entirely reclusive lives. When the answer to the question who has been exposed to the virus is almost everyone, then track and trace is a farce. To add insult to injury, the various track and trace programs are executed so inefficiently and managed so poorly that they would be as good as useless even if they did serve a useful purpose. The NHS test and trace staff make an average 0.4 calls a day, and this includes missed calls and wrong numbers. The staff report mostly sitting around and watching Netflix. The leakage, the number of people they are unable to trace, is very significant, which alone renders the program ineffective. Sage estimates that minimum 80% of the contacts need to be reached for the scheme to be effective. NHS test and trace manages barely above 50 to 60% at best. And then the test results take too long. Experts claim for test and trace to work well, results need to be turned around within 24 hours. In reality, the majority wait more than 48 hours. Meanwhile, government contractors are paid huge sums for doing a terrible job. The track and trace apps don't fare much better as there is significant, well-justified hesitancy to activate them. Software consultants found that the data security protection is weak for the vast majority of apps. The government has given vague assurances only as to privacy protection. The data are to be stored for 20 years, and various private companies such as Amazon Web Services have access. How their use of the data is limited and how this is enforced is not explained. The many scams that sprang up quickly make even some of those who might otherwise enthusiastically cooperate with test and trace programs or apps hesitant. Fake contact tracers have been phoning people to trick them into divulging credit card details to pay for COVID tests, and fake contact tracing apps are a new line in phishing. All in all, track and trace has been a failure. Ironically, the poor implementation of track and trace programs is the only silver lining, because if these programs were effective, they would be causing harm. The very concept of the COVID test and trace program is to de facto prevent herd immunity, find the healthy carriers of the virus, and stop the virus from spreading among the non-vulnerable population, thus stop building immunity in enough people before we go into the winter season. As the virus has burnt out by June, as respiratory viruses tend to do, and since then we've experienced very low hospitalizations and deaths, the summer season would be a fantastic opportunity to allow and encourage herd immunity to develop, allow people, especially the young and healthy, to go about their business unrestricted and hopefully achieve herd immunity quickly. Yet our government mandates the opposite. Even if the government is a fan of the vaccine solution, that will not happen before the winter season, but herd immunity developed in the summer months can. The interest of public health would dictate encouraging herd immunity, especially at a time when the virus ranks very low amongst the causes of mortality. Contact tracing and isolating asymptomatic cases causes direct harm. Testing in itself has quite a few problems which render testing programs useless. The most widely used and claimed to be most reliable COVID test, the PCR test, has been described by its inventor as unsuitable for the identification of infectious diseases. What is worse, it appears to test for the presence of genetic material present in all humans. The tests work by amplifying samples of genetic material. It appears that the rate of amplification would determine the rate of positives. Low amplification will mean close to all negatives. Very high amplification would result in close to 100% positives. So by setting the rate, the number of cycles, they can set how many positives they will find. This feature may come in very handy when a second wave is to be identified. When the government's policies are patently absurd, we can assume that they may be serving a different purpose than the stated goal. For example, declaring that to relax restrictive policies the rate of infections must fall, while the very policies prevent the rate of infections from falling, is truly Kafkaesque. And when the expensive track and trace programs are clearly pointless, ineffective, and if successful, mostly harmful, the true objective is probably not disease containment. It is concerning that beyond apps and test and trace programs, both of which already raise justified concerns about threats to privacy, geolocation, credit card information, and CCTV footage, including facial recognition, may be used to track people, all in the name of protecting us from this deadly virus. Even more concerning are references to behavioral science to get people to cooperate. When combined with laws that allow anyone to be removed if they are suspected of having been exposed to COVID, while quarantine camps are being set up in several countries, it appears also in the UK, test and trace appears rather sinister. In summary, there are serious questions about what the true goals of the expensive test and trace programs are, as COVID tests can be easily manipulated and privacy protection is not ensured. That the tests don't work and the programs are carried out with laughable inefficiency is an odd silver lining. But it is baffling that as COVID hospitalizations and deaths have dropped to very low levels, our government does all it can to trace and isolate asymptomatic cases, seemingly in a bid to prevent herd immunity. Sceptikat says this makes no sense. Join us for part 14, Only the Crazy Worry About Unsafe Vaccines. Thank you for watching. You can reach me, Kat Sceptikat, at sceptikat@peerlessreads.com, Andrew and Kat see it, or privately at kat@sceptikat.com.